But thank you everybody for having me here today. And so my talk today is based on my thesis, and the subtitle really is the price is righteous. And I'm looking and I'm honing in on the price being the price specifically of drugs, of medication as part of the bigger topic. And always good to start with a joke, not as much for you, but for me to get rid of my nerves. But you know, this is a guy in the lab, it's a huge breakthrough, and then you have to wait many years because we're still years away from being able to justify this outrageous price, and they're not far off. The cost of medicine in medicine, you know, follows, of course, the growth of the GDP, but it grows excessively, right? So the GDP of the US is $23 trillion. That is 23 times 10 to the 12th, or 1,000 billion. So it's a lot, right? It's a lot of money, the GDP, but in the US, we take an enormous amount of that GDP that we spend on healthcare. And I'm not gonna comment on what we get in return for that, because that is a whole other thesis. But we spend in the US $3.8 trillion on healthcare on an annual basis. That is a figure for 2019. That is approximately 18% of your GDP. If we put that in context, if we look at a global spend of GDP on healthcare, that is about 9.8%. And of course, in Europe, it's around 11, 12%. But so with 18%, we spend a gigantic, enormous amount of money on health. The health parameters, if you look at it, the outcomes are not necessarily reflective of that. But then again, it also depends on what part of the population you look at. So we're not going to go deeper into that. What I do want to quickly show if the thing, so I know this is an eye chart, I just don't want to, and I won't belabor it too much, but I want to show you is that the cost of prescription drugs in itself, if you look since 2000, has been around 11-12% of the cost of personal health care. The majority goes to hospital care, which is about 37%, and the rest is, you know, the professional services is 32%, with the majority going to physicians, nurses, and dentists, and all of that. But so prescription drugs since 2000 has been between 11 and 12%. It's just something to keep in mind that hasn't gone up significantly. And I also want to stress that we have to be very careful, because obviously at 18%, we want to save somewhere, and we want to make it sustainable. But I definitely don't want to have you take away from my talk that I feel that we should spend less on drugs. It is how we spend it and how we invest in it that I think could be challenged. Because I think the number of 11, 12% for drugs is probably not bad, because if you think about how much good drugs do in getting people to live healthier and better quality of lives and live longer, they definitely play an important role. I'm not an economist. I read a lot about economy in this book, but I'll cheat a little bit on my cheat sheet here. So economics is the study of rational choice. And speaking for myself, I can definitely tell you that, of course, ratio is something that is limited and not infinite. It's economics study the human behavior of how people choose between ends and limited means, and they can with limited means, and they can have alternative uses. So you have to make deliberate choices. What you're going to do with your money, where you're going to put it. And on the left-hand side, you see a statue in Edinburgh. Everybody knows Adam Smith. Everybody refers to him as the father of the free markets. And I think very important, he's the classical school of economics. He has the labor theory of value. He believes that the cost of goods is determined by how you produce it. So it is the labor value, the labor theory of value. The society, what he says is, there is the pursuit of self-interests is what ultimately, by individual economic actors, ultimately produces a socially beneficial outcome. So even though it's a selfish act, it leads to maximal national wealth, and that is because there is this competition. There's this competition to make it better, there's the competition to make it cheaper, and ultimately you have maximal national output. And that is really the Adam Smith, and that is really the foundation of the free market. It's about the beginning of the 1800s. This is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. About a century later, we have Alfred Marshall, another one of the big economists of that century. He's the neoclassical school, and we're Adam Smith is all about the production. Alfred Marshall moves it more towards the supply piece, and where he says the value comes in how the consumer sees the value of the product. So the just price comes from production, the just price comes from the value that the consumer attaches to it. Now, both of them agree in the school that they both agree that it is this pursuit of self-interest and competition that leads to a maximal and socially benign outcome. It's important to keep that in mind. However, what both of them did get wrong is that what you need for these free markets to work, whether it is supply side or demand side, is you need perfect competition. And this slide, and I date myself because this was one of my favorite shows when I was in high school, was ER. It doesn't apply in medicine. So by definition, the whole free market paradigm doesn't work in medicine, because for you to have perfect competition, you can have no asymmetry. And the asymmetry in medicine, for one, exists because the doctor knows much more about the condition than the patient. So how they explain it, they can fool you, right? They can be this, the snake oil salesman, so to speak. There's also the fact that often it's urgent, and you don't have the time to go shop around like you would for a car, let alone that you can start negotiating price, or that you would want to choose, you don't choose the disease as you would choose a commodity like a car or a house or whatever. So the competition, or the perfect competition doesn't apply in medicine. The other big thing, though, so the fact that it's not a perfect competition, and so that the rules of free market of the classical and neoclassical schools of economics don't apply. The bigger piece, though, that I want to address today in my talk is that of corporatocracy. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but I'll go deeper in it, because this country, the US, is absolutely averse to big government. From the very beginning, they wanted people to pursue their own interests, and that is why it is so close to the free market and to capitalism. But they resented big government, and they believed that having big government influence anything in life, including the economics, including business, would be a bad thing. What I want to pose here is that I believe that over time, the big companies, the monopolies that we've seen emerge over time, I'll come back to it in a second, have actually taken over the role of big government and play the role of big government. And so we have a bit of an ironic situation. How did that come about? Since the 70s, there's been an incredible movement, and there's a lot of great literature on this that I can recommend after the talks later tonight if people want to talk about it. But on the left, you have Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was the prodigy. If Adam Smith is the father of free market economics, he is the prodigal son. University of Chicago, he has pushed this. He got the Nobel Prize for this. He pushed capitalism to a almost mythical religion in this country, and all companies have MBAs and people that follow this strategy. They've had huge impact on many economies in the world. So that is one group. The other piece so what happened is there is this person, Lewis Powell, who wrote a memo in 1971 at the attack on American free enterprise system. And a book by Jane Meyer, she says it electrified the conservative right in this country. And so what you see is you saw universities, academics start pushing for a capitalistic economic school. That's Milton Friedman and the School of Chicago. But you also had in courses, people were going to what we refer to as originalism with George Bork there and Scalia, who ultimately sat on the Supreme Court. Supreme Court started making decisions that would allow companies to make, to lead to monopolies, where normally you'd want to steer away from that, by limiting the amount or having such a narrow interpretation of the Constitution. They could keep big government out of all of the business, leading them to make decisions that they could form these monopolies. When we talk about just prices, the things that always come up, of course, is the Shkreli here and the Purdue Pharma story. Shkreli jacked up prices. He bought a company, then he jacks up the price by 5,000% overnight of an essential drug. Fortunately, those things are criminal. They get easily picked up in criminal justice. He's now serving 7 years in jail. He's no longer allowed to work in the biopharma industry. Purdue is, of course, it's perverse that you would continue to push a certain drug and have aggressive marketing if you find out that what you're pushing is absolutely hurting people. So if you put the profit before the positive output of patients, that is, of course, criminal, and that is easy to pick up. What is more tricky is everything else that goes in the pricing through this corporatocracy, how we are allowing these monopolies to decide what you get for the price. One thing is that we've created a system in the US with so many insurance companies, which is quite dilapidated. However, we've only got 3 groups negotiating the price. So the patient, first of all, doesn't pay most of the time for their thing, for the treatment they need, because it goes through the insurance. And the insurance doesn't negotiate the price with the manufacturers. They negotiate via pharmacy benefit managers. There's only 3 big groups. 80% of the pharmacy benefit managers are 3 companies. You'd think that that would give you negotiating power, that now you can negotiate for the patient because you're a strong group. However, how do they get paid? They get paid on a fraction of how much they save the insurance companies. So they're all almost incentivized to sometimes go for the more expensive drug on which they can negotiate a bigger rebate because that goes in their pocket. So it is a little bit tricky. And this one is, for me, the most critical slide of what is going on and why we can change as physicians and researchers, why we can have an impact on what's going on here. Of the prescriptions dispensed, 90% of them are generic drugs today. 10% are brand name drugs. However, if you look at the costs, and we're going back to that $3.6 trillion, 79% of the cost of prescription drugs is those 10% branded drugs. Was that a question or a disagreement? Okay. Anyway, if you think about how long a drug is protected for, about 14 years on average. It's 20 years is the patent life, but after the clinical trials and all of that, it's about 14 years that you can capitalize on your uniqueness. Surely 80% of the value that we have in drugs today that we get to patients doesn't come from these brand name drugs. So we're doing something here that is not correct. The cost of R&D, and it's almost irrelevant, but the cost of R&D is very good articles written on it. It's somewhere between $1 to $3-4 billion. And of course, the more complex the diseases that you're trying to tackle, the costlier. So if you look at oncology drugs, they're about $4 billion to develop. More simple molecules, about $1 billion to develop. What you also need to know is that when I looked in my thesis at what big pharma, and big pharma are those that make the most money, the ones that you all know, the Merck, the Johnson & Johnsons, the Gileads. The big pharma, they, in the last 5 years, have only been held, they only managed to get 20% of the new drugs to the market. So 80% is being made somewhere else by more nimble, more creative, smaller groups. But when I look at that, they didn't spend between $1 and $4 billion on each molecule they got approved. They spend $10 billion on each. So either they are very inefficient or they are going after very complex diseases that just take more money. I think it's the latter. One of the issues that goes on in research and in what we're putting our money is that we're not going after the most courageous, the boldest project. We are very often trying to go after a Me Too, a copycat product. You make a left-turning isomer of Prilosec, which is an acid blocker. You just switch, you make the mirror image, you get a new patent, and again, you've got $1 billion blockbuster for many years to come without any added value, but it sustains the price very highly. What also happens is once you know what a drug does, your safety profile becomes pretty well predictable. And all you're going to start and do is try and target different diseases or disease states or stages, and it becomes a game of playing statistical power rather than clinical significance. And very often you will read papers that have a statistically significance because the companies will always be there with their leaflet on the p-value. But then if you really go into the clinical value, it is often remarkable, but they do get the reimbursement for it, even though, you know, what adds 2-3 months of life to a patient's life in the grand scheme of things for $100,000, for example. The cost of R&D, as I said, is almost irrelevant because of what I call the financialization of the R&D. And there's a fantastic book. It's a page turner if you love the pharma industry. It's called For Blood and Money. It came out this summer. It's a story of a specific, it's targeted drug. The company is called Pharmacyclics. And the investment was about $1 billion, but even give them $4 billion. I think in the book they mentioned $1 billion, but let's say it's an oncology drug. It works fantastic for hematologic patients. It is truly challenging the status quo. It's worth a premium price. But what happened is when the company got sold, investors made a return on their money 30 to 70 times. And so it was sold for $42 billion. So all of a sudden, the price of your development becomes irrelevant because the acquirers, Gilead and Johnson & Johnson, now all of a sudden have to make up for $42 billion to recoup their investment. So the investment in the R&D is peanuts compared to the investment of the financial institutions. And this is where I believe that greed has taken over a little bit. And I absolutely believe that Pharmacyclics product is fantastic. It deserves a premium price. It does not deserve that we have to pay these investors a tenfold of the investment. And so you all know this movie, same era as the ER series, the 80s, Wall Street. You know, Gecko is a tycoon, and his famous quote kind of summarizes this social Darwinism that Milton Friedman preaches. Greed, for the lack of better words, is good. Greed is right, greed works. Greed captures the evolutionary spirit. Greed has marked the upward surge of mankind. And we cannot have that. And when we go back to Adam Smith was definitely on the same page. He was very much about having virtuous leaders put goalposts and guidances in place. So what we have to do is we have to go back to virtuous competition. And so the solution does still live within a capitalistic system, because ultimately capitalistic systems are the ones where you do motivate people to do certain things that bring benefit to the people. We see less of that in communistic, socialistic systems. So capitalism in se is not bad. Profit in itself is not unethical. This is Joseph Schumpeter, and he is the conceiver of the concept of creative destruction, that in capitalism, there will always be winners and losers. And I think that is exactly where we have to be. We have to be a little bit more bold. We have to push industry to be bold about the studies that we invest in. And of course, because we read the articles, we are reviewers of articles, we do the clinical research, we should be bold and say, hey, either we're going to go after transformational innovation, or we're going after Me Too. And it is also fine, because the Me Too products, they need to compete on price. That's fine. It's a big unmet need to keep it sustainable. You make them compete on price. If it's transformational, you deserve your premium pricing. So with that, I come to my conclusion. We have to compete on very bold products where the delta is very obvious, where you don't have to look at the statistical analysis, you look at the clinically meaningfulness of your outcomes. That is a graph of the overall survival of a checkpoint inhibitor compared to chemotherapy in lung cancer patients. If you know anything about Kaplan-Meier curves, you know, when they diverge that much, you know, I had a professor who told me, if you can put your elbow between a Kaplan-Meier curve, it is good. Well, that's what you want. You want clear, meaningful clinical benefit to be obvious, not something where you have to play with the statistics in order to make that work. And you have, in the US, you have to let these companies compete and have transparency in pricing. I think the Inflation Reduction Act of Joe Biden is a very good thing, because how can it be that if you get an approval in the US for a cancer drug, that automatically the CMS has to pay for it without being able to argue and negotiate the price? So virtuous competition is the solution. It can stay in a capitalistic system, and it will only accelerate the innovation that we will get for our money. So with that, I think I may have gone over. But thank you.
Thank you.